Welcome to the UNSECURITY podcast. Each week, Evan and Brad give an inside look at current information security news, breaches, best practices, and other things you should know to improve your information security. Here are your hosts, FRSecure's Evan Francine and Brad Nye.
All right, welcome back. This is episode 70 of the UNSECURITY podcast. I'm your host this week, Brad Nye. Today is March 9th, and Evan is taking a well-deserved vacation. So joining me this afternoon is Ryan, RC. I'm going to try to figure out how many times I can say your name wrong before you get mad and just interrupt me.
Hey, somebody's going to start a Twitter survey on this, Brad. I've gotten a lot of feedback about the last name issues. They said, what's the deal? So, yes, glad to be here with you. And you're absolutely right. Evan does need that vacation, probably more than most.
Yes, yeah. So we are recording in the afternoon. You are in Dallas now? Is that where you're at?
I'm in Austin,
okay.
Texas. Our conference that we're attending, the Dallas Department of Information Resources Information Security Forum, is still ongoing. So I know there's been a lot of talk of the coronavirus, and South by Southwest was canceled here in Austin. So what that means for us is the price of the hotel room did not go down, but the availability of dining options went up.
Oh, there you go. I like the positive outlook. So before we really dig in, let's recap last week. What were you up to last week?
Well, last week we were recovering from RSA. That was quite the adventure. Making some progress on S2 school, working with a lot of districts last week. We've kind of crossed that barrier of is this an issue? Do we need to do something? And so last week and even this week, given that it's only, Monday, already fielded a lot of calls about insurance and about school shutdowns. The big talk last week was around what happens if we have to close our district because of this current coronavirus situation.
Mm-hmm.
So been putting a lot of time and thought into that and helping manage some crisis plans. That was pretty full week for me just doing that because there are different political opinions on the topic. There's different regional considerations.
Mm-hmm.
So there is no blanket answer for any one school, but it's been interesting to kind of hear the different concerns that communities have about this and different approaches they'd take to manage it.
Yeah, it was interesting. We just got emails today from the school district my kids are in and how they're going to be handling it. And it's pretty interesting because the basically 4th through 12th graders have iPads. There's not going to be a significant disruption if they need to physically close the building. So that was pretty cool to see, that use of technology there.
Yeah, and I know, it's interesting you bring that up. The friend of mine who works at a supply house, if you will, they just shipped, I think, 10 million Chromebooks to the West Coast.
Wow. Yeah.
So it's a lot of schools are preparing for this. It's one challenge though that came up last week that nobody really thought about was not everybody has internet access.
Mm-hmm.
So what do we do for the students that don't have internet access at home? And how are we going to provide learning options for them?
Mm-hmm.
Should we need to close the school down?
Yeah.
And nobody really had a good answer yet.
Yeah, they actually had a little survey for the K through 3 that said if you don't have the access, fill this out. And I guess they have some plans around it. I didn't click through it. I didn't have a chance to. But yeah, that's an interesting thing that maybe people don't think about because of how common it is. All right, so figured we'll just edit that part out. Figure with Evan out. Ryan and I were talking last week, and it's hard to ignore Super Tuesday, and so we're gonna go and discuss election security. Thought that was something that we were both pretty interested in, and we're gonna try to keep this as non-political as possible. This is not a political podcast, but we want to talk about the security aspect of it, because this is a big deal, regardless of where you fall. So, this is not something new. We've heard and read about the the 2016 elections. This is something that goes back even well beyond that, before that. So we're just going to go and have a conversation about that. Sound good, Ryan?
Absolutely, man. You know me, always happy to talk about this stuff.
So we will get out some articles. Like I said, with Evan being on vacation, the show notes will be delayed, but we'll make sure we get these out in some way. But I put together and just read some articles. The first one is on Wired. It's about DARPA's voting machine at DEF CON's Hacker Village. And it was really funny to read. I thought, I've obviously identified the issue of needing a secure voting method. So they put together what they think would be the initial prototype of a secure voting machine. And it didn't do well.
Well, I think so, better than most. If it's connected, it's hackable, right? And this idea that something is unhackable is not soundly based in science. If it was built by a human, it can be broken by a human, right? I think they did an extraordinary job of making an attempt to make it very difficult to do so. But there is no such thing as unhackable, and so I think it's more of a mindset shift away from creating this iron vault, if you will, this proverbial Fort Knox that does not exist in the world of connected computing, and go more for, would it alert someone if it was being tampered with? Mm-hmm. Nobody seems to be taking the tampering angle to say, well, we know that buildings aren't impervious to burglary. So what do? We put in mechanisms that alert us to when someone's tampering with the building or attempting to make entry. We don't make this assumption that the building cannot be broken into. Not even Fort Knox do they make that assumption, right? They've built this amazing secured facility, and yet they still have surveillance cameras and motion sensors and armed guards and all these additional protections, even though it's literally Fort Knox, right? And we use that, anecdotally to talk about when something's really, really secure. And even then they have to have that human element to watch. And so I think, great attempt, mm-hmm. but it's just not in line with reality. And I think that's true for the majority of voting machines out in the market space. The other thing that, came to light as I was reading through these articles is the inconsistency mm-hmm. Across the states. And even within the states themselves, there's inconsistency as to the type of voting machine being used, and definitely state by state, the type of voting method. Some states have the full digital. Some states have, like here in Minnesota, we have the paper ballot, which is then run through a Scantron. Mm-hmm. And, from my personal perspective, I feel like that's a more trustworthy system. Right. Because it's a second factor, right? There's still a sheet of paper somewhere that if there was a recount needed, a manual recount could be performed. Where I get pretty gravely concerned is in the states that don't have a paper mechanism and rely solely on digital input as their source of truth. Could make it really hard to reconstruct.
Right. Well, and given the fact that, basically in the latest, at the latest hacker, village, that voting village at DEF CON, this is from, in October, basically they were able to hack into all 100 voting machine types that were there. Right. So, what do they have in place to show what happened? And that's the problem. And yeah, I'm with you. The paper ballots do give you that hard trail if there was any sort of inconsistencies. The other thing that was interesting is, and I'm looking for my article right now, is in I can't find it now. There was the race in Pennsylvania a couple years ago. Oh, there it is. It was November of 2019. The Northampton County, Pennsylvania candidate for judge came up with 164 votes out of 55,000 cast, which is like not possible. They then hand scanned the ballots, and he showed up as the winner. But there was no disinformation there. There was no evidence of hacking. So what happened, right? It's technology. A bug could happen. So having those paper ballots really does provide that additional layer of assurance that there hasn't been any kind of foul play in place.
Exactly. And to that point, I mean, that's part of this greater conversation, right? We can throw all kinds of security controls at the technology, but what's the process, right?
Right.
And that seems to be wildly inconsistent. It reminds me, and I'm going to show my age a little bit here. It reminds me of the dispute in Florida back in the old Gore Bush election,
the
right?
Hanging
The hanging Chad. Yes, right? And that was a solely paper-based system, right? And that led to a debacle. And so that for me highlights that it's not even so much a technology problem at that point, but it is a process. Mm-hmm. How do you ensure the integrity of the vote? And that's really, I think, the core question is, regardless of the method the vote is collected, how do you ensure the integrity? And so I think there are technological things we can do. Multiple verifications, back to kind of my comment earlier about, who gets alerted when something's not right?
Right.
Whether that's a bug, whether that's active tampering, how do these election officials become aware that something's amiss? Because they might, let's play out a scenario. You go to your local polling station and that machine's behaving incorrectly. If they had a visibility and awareness to that, they may choose to temporarily suspend that polling station.
Yeah.
They may choose to say, you know what, we can't count this.
Yeah. You have to go to some other failover solution. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. And in Minnesota, no problem. We've got paper. So we can go back very quickly and very easily and reconstruct those votes. But in those states that are dependent on a digital only system, I don't know how they would do that.
Yeah,
I don't know if it's using a technology like Worm, right? Is it maybe using a read or a single way write?
Yeah,
is that a method? Is it shipping it off to 2 or 3 off box servers for integrity checks?
Well,
maybe a hardware key or something.
Yeah, but part of the problem is then we want to keep it simple, right? We start getting too complex, and now we've added a lot of issues in there. So, I think those are good ideas. And they're not, necessarily. I don't know. There's a lot to unpack, right? I think some of the bigger issues is regardless of what you want to do, there's no, I think you went across it. There's no standards, right? The current testing standards are from 2005 for the federal testing for elections. I don't know about you, but I'm pretty sure things have changed just a bit in the last 15 years.
Just a smidge. Just a smidge.
There's no federally mandated security standard at this point for voting machine manufacturers. Right? They literally connect to the internet and have open USB. So until I think you hit some of those more basic things, all the rest of it's kind of a moot point. We need to have some sort of a standard across. Now, how the states actually do it, that's fine, but to have 20 different types or 100 different types that are not standardized is just asking for trouble.
You're absolutely right. And I find it a little bit surprising because if we look to the gaming industry, okay, another machine that is highly regulated. Well, let's think about gaming machines. There are some standards around that. You don't just get to make a gaming machine and then install it in a casino. Right? There's a whole process behind that. There's verification, random spot checks, etc. Now, obviously, a casino machine is going to be in use more than one day every 4 years, right? But I suppose the voting machines, you've got your locals as well. But even still, their utilization is less. but they've got process for that. And I wonder if maybe that's a place to almost borrow from and say, well, you have really stringent standards around the manufacture of gaming machines. You have really stringent standards around the manufacture of automotive computers.
Yeah.
Why can't we take a more stringent? And I don't even know. I love the idea that, there would be some kind of federal mandate, but at the same time, we've seen where that doesn't always work as intended. And I almost wonder if this isn't something for ISO or IEEE, create a standard for checking for any machine that you expect to have infallible integrity of the data.
Yeah. Well, I mean, even if they followed some even if it wasn't very prescriptive, right? Just having updated guidelines that state it can't connect to the internet. It can't have open USB, right? Some of these basic things would be, a good start at a minimum. And
lock the lock. Right. I saw a video on YouTube where the person was doing a security test on the voting machine, and they gained access to the internals simply by pushing the button on the side of the machine, and the panel dropped down, and then they had full access direct to the hard drive, to the motherboard. I mean, all the components were right there. Easily accessible within the voting booth itself, within the privacy of the voting booth. Yeah. So I think, maybe it's a low tech option, some tamper tape.
Right. Well, so I found an article from darkreading.com. It was on February 7th of this year, 5 measures to harden election technology. And it was the part 2 of it. And I really thought that they nailed 5 steps. Here's what we can do to increase the security. And I thought they did a good job. So we'll go through those real quick. The first one was use single purpose systems. Well, that seems a little obvious, I think, but it's not, right? This is what it's for elections and secure device management. And that's it. It should be locked down so that that's all it can do.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's what we do with ATMs.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good analogy.
And I think if we can do it with an automated teller, I would suspect those very same manufacturers would be able to assist in helping create a secure voting machine. So I completely agree with that. I think limit scope and limit purpose. I mean, that's what we teach people all the time, right? You and I work with customers all the time, and we say, hey, maybe the server that doesn't need email access shouldn't have email access turned on. So I don't think this is unfortunately, it's not a new concept, but it might be new to those in the election world who traditionally don't necessarily deal with security or any real IT issue.
So you mean you shouldn't just install the software and leave it at default configs?
I mean, you can. But
that leads to that 100% hack rate at DEF CON. Yep, go ahead.
Oh, no, you hit the nail on the head with that one. It's, it's taking some of these fundamentals. I mean, we talk about that so much on this podcast because it is so important. It's fundamentals.
Yep.
And I think, this shouldn't be as complicated as it seems to be to the point you made earlier. Why are there 100 versions out there for something that is paramount to our governmental structure? Like, I get that I've got 100 options of chapstick, or I've got 100 options of pogo stick, right? I get that. That makes sense to me. When it comes to national defense, when it comes to, those systems that we rely on to keep, our governmental process honest, I don't know. 100 seems like a pretty wide swath, that could allow for error. And maybe it's more stringent, follow a model similar to the DoD. There's not 100 vendors of a particular, system control technology, right? Or FAA. I mean, let's even go a little bit more consumer side to something we touch every day. Think about all those air traffic control systems.
Yeah.
It's fairly limited in scope and very stringent in order to be able to create one, or medical devices for that matter, right? You can't just make a pacemaker.
Right. You have to go through a process. Yeah, I agree. It is a little surprising that when I read that the testing standards haven't been updated since 2005, it's like, wow, why not? So measure number 2, build in defense in depth. We preach that all the time. It's fundamentals. Don't have a single point of failure.
Well, and yeah, the challenge. So back to that complexity, right? You don't want to have that single point of failure, but given the nature and type of the polling system, right? My local polling station, for me personally, is a auditorium of the church.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't really have a lot of robust infrastructure, if you will, to kind of support that. And I don't know if the voting machines live there year round in a lock cabinet or not, but that's
yeah, I don't know.
I don't know how they would do that.
I think you could do some stuff around, there's one level of access to cast the vote, but then a separate level to actually see a database or be able to access the data of what was voted, right? So yeah, you've got a user level, just keep it simple, that as the voter comes in, they push who they're voting for and it registers it. But then if you were to actually try to get into that system, it's a separate level, different accounts, different security to actually be able to access it.
Are you suggesting that we do something like multi-factor authentication?
It probably wouldn't be a bad idea. I could see how that would be really difficult, potentially to implement across that many devices. But there's got to be something, right?
Well, I think actually you really touched on the core of it. Different user types. The standard use of operation really should be a one-way type of interaction.
Yeah.
And once that right happens, it shouldn't, in theory, right? Just like the paper ballot, it shouldn't be allowed to be modified.
Right.
And I'm guessing that, a fair amount of these databases behind the scenes are not set up, to, enforce that. That they probably, I would venture to guess, and I haven't personally, pen tested any of this stuff, but I would venture to guess there's probably not even fundamental logging turned on to indicate, which machine registered what data entry at what point in time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And who accessed and did what. I can say from what I've seen that a lot of them don't have that. And that leads to number 3 of limiting privileges. So we already kind of touched on it, but don't give people access they don't need, right?
Right.
Not hard.
Yeah, you definitely want to limit that. It's, but also keep in mind too, I'm guessing that, I know for at least for my polling station, right? These are not paid people. They're volunteers. Right. They do this once every couple of years at most. And my guess is they probably don't get a lot of training around, how to look for suspicious behavior, how to, interact with those systems safely.
Yeah. So I think part of that's why I think that you count on volunteers to do this. And these are people that, it's an election is typically once a year with presidential every 4, obviously. Right. So build in the system, those privileges so that they have confidence to know, if it's up and running, we're safe. We're good. Right. They don't need to worry about who did they log in as and what would happen if they accidentally did something wrong. Make that as foolproof as possible by building that security into the back end.
Yeah, I agree. And, while it might sound hard, it's not.
No.
Now it's different across, 100 plus manufacturers.
Well, yeah.
It's, implementing who knows how many flavors and variants of code bases and databases and, et cetera, et cetera. But as a high level, I think it's absolutely something that could be done. I know in the example I referred to earlier in this YouTube video, I mean, the assumption is that anyone that had physical access to the innards also had admin level permission. Well, if physical access can be gained by pushing on the button that opens the panel, you know, that kind of stuff too. I think that's, you know, when we talk about build-in, you know, defense in depth, when we talk about limiting privilege, let's not let the simple stuff get past us. Let's make sure that device is physically secured as much as it can be against tampering, both physically and digitally. Because, you know, while yes, these machines can be, if they're connected to the internet, accessed, there's also that physical risk that a bad actor, you know, could manipulate an offline machine as well. Yeah. And I think that, you know, as we think about, you know, how do we secure these devices in between the elections? You know, I think there's lots of room to improve, I guess. So if any voting machine vendors are listening, you know, feel free to give us a call. We'll gladly throw some ideas at you.
Yeah. No kidding. So measure 4 on this one was use multiple counting systems and cross-check. So the example they gave was the person goes into the voting machine, they punch in who they're going to vote for. It spits out a paper ballot with a scan on it, and then would go to a tallying system where that code is scanned. So in this case, you have 3 different points of data to look at. So you have what was the physical ballot, what did it look like that they took, what did the voting machine record, and then what is the tallying machine or system showing. So now, you know, you as a voter, you vote who you're going to vote for, you verify it on the paper slip, and then submit it for scanning. You have 3 places that you can now validate that information. And that's not really a difficult implementation. It's pretty straightforward and simple. Obviously, there's a lot behind the scenes that goes on, but to me, it makes sense. Keep it simple.
Well, and we already have those systems in place today.
Right.
Think about a prescription. Think about financial transactions, right? There are checks and balances, right? Just, you know, prescriptions come to mind. We have multiple checks and balances around prescription issuance, especially these days, right? We maybe didn't do so hot a couple of years ago, and then a lot of people got a lot of pills out of these pill mills. But then we really, you know, turned the screws on that, and it didn't take very long to implement these prescription checks where there's now a state authority who, right. You know, you go to Walgreens and, you know, not to pick on Walgreens, CVS, you know, insert favorite pharmacy here, but they have to submit to the state board what they've been issuing, as well as the doctors have to submit to the state board what they've been prescribing, so that they can kind of keep a check on that. And so I can't imagine, you know, it sounds complicated, but again, these are problems that have been solved multiple times for multiple industries. And I think we would benefit if we would start to leverage some of those existing methods instead of trying to reinvent the wheel.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say is it seems like there's a lot of exactly that, trying to reinvent the wheel rather than using lessons learned from existing systems, right? We've got, you know, ATMs and the pharmacy and all these things that take parts of what would be needed. They're already out there and proven. Now, are they flawless? No. But why wouldn't you start with something that has a track record instead of trying to build something from scratch?
Well, and it goes back to that. I think there's so many people in the game that it's almost the
money grab, as Evan says.
Yeah, it is. It's the cash grab, and what's the incentive, right? You know, I know that you've been working a lot on CMMC, because the same problem existed, if you will, where the Department of Defense had all these different vendors doing all these different things different ways, and they said, no, enough is enough. We need to at least know where they are in the spectrum. And I think same is true. I mean, the idea that I can just create my own voting machine and then take it to market shocks me.
Right. Yeah, it is a little surprising. And yeah, I can't talk anyway. What we've seen is really, it's pretty mind blowing. But, so the last measure they mentioned is layered security measures for election devices. So this goes to your comment around, needing some sort of tamper tape, right? How do you layer to prevent tampering, to prevent rogue software? Easily, it's not foolproof, right? But if you can have some sort of physical protection in place, that makes the hacking so much harder.
Just, I go back to, years ago, I had a alarm on my computer panel, on my home PC. And if you opened the side panel without disabling the alarm through the password protected BIOS, it would make a screaming sound. It was a 6-cent piezo speaker and a 6-cent switch. So I think, there's a lot of room to improve with very little in the means of heavy financial burden on these vendors, right? Mm-hmm. A simple audible tamper alarm if somebody opens the side panel could do wonders for reducing the risk. You still have that whole internet factor, but I think you and I are in pretty strong agreement that during the voting process, I don't know that an internet connection's something that should be on and active. I think there are more secure ways to bundle and ship that data for tabulation than a real-time wide open connection to the internet.
Well, yeah. And that's where you're going to hit that functionality argument of people saying, well, wait a minute, how come we have to wait for results? Right. People are kind of used to.
Convenience and impatience. I want CNN to tell me who won before we've actually counted the votes.
Right. Well, and there's going to be a huge amount of pushback from that. And regardless of we know that's not good security practice, but the reality is who's going to end up winning that?
Maybe here's where we learn a lesson from the DMV. Because nothing ever seems to happen fast there.
Hey, there you go.
I'm still waiting. I think I'm on month number 3 now, waiting for my new ID, which is supposedly going to show up in 3 more months.
Oh, fun. Yeah. Well, I don't think people, would be very happy waiting 3 months to hear the results.
Right.
But there's got to be a happy medium between the two.
Well, and I think too that at least anecdotally in the conversations that I've had with folks about this, both technical and non-technical, I think given the last election cycle and all the concern about the integrity of the vote, if you would, I heard a lot of people, say, look, we got to do something about this. I think there is a willingness on behalf of the average voter to adopt that change, right? To maybe, they don't obviously want to wait days for results. They don't want to be, overly inconvenienced. But I think there is an understanding that if we needed to put an extra step in for security and to ensure the integrity of their vote, most people that I've interacted and spoke with have been okay with that idea. They didn't see it as a big burden to them as much as they said, no, I really would like to be able to trust the election. Yeah.
Well, and I think so. Going to one of the other articles here that we'll put is from the Washington Post. Cybersecurity 202: voting machines touted as secure option are actually vulnerable to hacking. What's kind of sucks is, and I think this is where having the lack of standards and the lack of any formal testing is going to be the issue. The ballot marking devices. So that's the where you go in and put your vote and it spits out the paper ballot, right? That's really seems to be to me, probably the best way to do it. It's kind of the best of both worlds. The issue is the machines like in Pennsylvania where they went crazy and did the wrong winner and had like the 144 votes out of the 55,000. You don't have any standards. You're not having any testing. Without that baseline, without those requirements, even the best design or intentions is it any good, right? What's the point?
Well, yeah. Again, it's, and you've heard me talk about this many times. In our race to adopt convenience, we've kind of stepped over common sense.
Mm-hmm.
And, to have the ability to create this machine again without a standard just doesn't seem like it was well thought through. That somebody went, oh, this will make our lives as counters easier. Let's implement that. Because it didn't change. If anything, it added a step to the voter. Right now, I got to go from my little ballot box over to the machine. Granted, it's not terribly inconvenient, but it's an added step for the voter. But they just kind of adopted this tech, and now they've spent these hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars on all this, and now they're standing around going, well, what did we do? Well, so I do think paper versus, digital only for me just seems inherently dangerous.
Mm-hmm. And
it makes it almost impossible to reconstruct what the truth is should something happen to that system. And then, hey, let's not forget blue screens still happen.
Right. Well, and I think the technology on this one is for the BMDs, as they call them, it shows the value there, right? If the digital recording piece goes crazy for whatever reason, you do have that paper, that physical ballot to fall back on. And they were able to do it. So I think it's a good proof of concept that it's got those checks and balances to ensure that the correct outcome is ultimately arrived at. But again, without having any sort of standard to build against, or without having, secure requirements, what's the value there? So I think it kind of goes back to, we need some sort of a standard out there across, the industry for these people to be held accountable to the vendors, the manufacturers.
I 100% agree. I mean, we're talking about this Washington Post article, and the image in this article shows the voting machine, and then it shows a standard issue off-the-shelf HP printer.
Well, okay, so it's not perfect,
right? But I think, but to that point, if there was a standard for testing,
mm-hmm.
then you would say, okay, we're going to use commercial off-the-shelf printer, but it's got to pass this level of rigor, right? Or,
right.
it has to be at least patched within, X amount of weeks of the voting cycle or something. I mean, and the reason it caught my eye is because I just got done working with a district on getting their HP printers out of the environment because they had a lot of legacy printers that were affected by those critical vulnerabilities.
Yeah, you definitely would not want any sort of network connectivity on that printer. The nice thing is with that setup, though, you don't need network connectivity for the actual voting process, right? So you go up to the machine, hit the touchscreen, it prints out your paper. There's no requirement for network connectivity, so that does eliminate a lot of that, which is good. Now, whether or not they actually do it or not is a different story. It's tough to tell from that picture how many cords are going up and down and what's actually attached. Right.
But still, I think, you hit the key point, though. It's back to what we were saying earlier, right? Single purpose use, isolation. Don't just because it can do 50 other things, maybe
right.
That stuff should be shut off, right? I mean, think about your standard firewalls that we run into. So many times I run into the fanciest next-gen firewall with very little rules actually set up and configured.
Mm-hmm. Well, so just to kind of throw a wrench into this, what's interesting is you've got, like Oregon, for sure, I know, does their elections by mail, right? That's a totally different set of, concerns. But it goes to, there's no real standard out there that shows that to follow. Everybody's on their own.
Yeah, it does seem to be, I think of it akin to the privacy law challenge we have, right? And maybe this is, maybe this starts to become a singular topic, right? Maybe it's about how do you ensure the data integrity of systems like voting, DMV, some of these critical systems that we rely on for our society to function, that are owned and operated by the governments that we put into power. How do we set those standards and say, look, this is the minimum testing required for software that handles sensitive data that potentially has an impact on our society from a governmental perspective, right? Because we've sure done that for other areas, right? We've definitely addressed testing standards in the medical industry, and of course, none of this is infallible, right? There's always stuff that slips through the cracks, but we at least made an effort. And in the election space, I don't see us making a lot of effort around the election voting technologies. I see a lot of that energy being spent on the voter. And we won't unpack that any further because that starts to get into that political territory. But and just as a citizen, put my security guy hat on the shelf for a second. Just as a citizen and as a voter, I just don't know that they're doing enough. And so I know myself, I'll be, trying to find out, who are the committees responsible for this type of stuff, even within our own state. And do they have the necessary resources? So kind of a call to action for our listeners, if you will. You're security professionals and you're doing this. Reach out to your local entities and see if there's a way to get involved. I know MSISAC has done an extensive amount of work trying to protect the elections, right? And there's a lot of information sharing going on within that organization about some of the challenges. But they're not in a position to make policy. They're not in a position to set standard, if you will. But maybe it's time for us as the professionals in this industry to step up and start to offer our services and our help.
Yeah. It'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see what happens. I'm hoping that it doesn't take a crisis, as it were, to force action. We don't want to get to that point.
Well, one question I got asked last week that I thought was really interesting. Somebody had asked me, well, how's voting going to work if this whole coronavirus thing's happening?
Yeah. Well,
right. If people, and do people know how to vote by mail?
Yeah. I know, here in Minnesota, they made the absentee voting a lot easier. Like I needed to do that the 1 year because I'd traveled and was not going to be here. It was super simple. It was not nearly that easy in other states that I've lived in to do that and make it difficult. Well, what's the benefit there? So again, I think that goes back to everybody runs things their own way. And when you do that, you start getting into complexity and that's the enemy of good security. So let's try and keep it simple and do the basics and the fundamentals. All right. Anything else on that, Ryan?
No, this has been great.
We could probably go for a lot longer, but I don't know how long people want to hear us talking about it. So we will move on to some news here. I actually do want to talk about these and spend a little time on it because the first one was Threat Post, and I thought kind of not surprising, but kind of amusing given our topic today. Trump and Sanders are the top brands for cyber criminals. Not at all surprising, but what they're seeing is the spam is coming up for using those two as the front runners now.
Well, it follows, I'm not surprised, right? It follows the scammers' MO, right? Mm-hmm. They generally, their scams are going to fit the narrative of the day, right? So we saw this with, obviously the closer we get to the election, the more that they're going to be leveraging that, and doing, trying to scam people. Same thing with this, whole outbreak situation or whatever it is. We've seen a huge increase in that. The closer we get to April, we're going to see those tax scams pop up even harder. Right. So I totally see this being the technique they're using.
It was interesting to me to see. So in the article, they have some graphs and of what they call that unsolicited commercial email. Trump was 68%, and then the Democrats were broken out. Sanders was at 8%. Biden 5%, Warren 5%, Buttigieg 7%, Bloomberg 4%, right? So kind of
Wait. You can pronounce his name right, but you can't do mine?
I'm just doing it to you as for fun at this point, to be completely honest. That was pretty funny. Klobuchar at 3. There you go. I throw the last one in there. But it was kind of interesting to me to see, where they're at in the polls really did align kind of with what the percentages were. And the data was from January 9th to February 29th. So, that was pretty interesting that the more polarizing they are, and being that Democrats have more running right now, that it was split up, but it seemed to be fairly even with what you would expect based on polling data.
Yeah, I'm looking at the second graphic here with the suspicious domains registered, and Trump accounted for 51%. So, yeah, I think, and because, this year is especially charged, if that's a way to phrase it, I think people are more susceptible to clicking because they're already in a fevered state. Like, one of the things that I think the scammers are having great success with this is that it is a more emotional and very personal type of topic. And so I think they're really exploiting the fact that people are in a lowered sense of risk because they're in a heightened state of emotion when it comes to this particular topic. And I think the scammers are using that to their advantage.
Yeah, it's like that lack of situational awareness, right? You kind of let your emotions run, and in this highly charged environment, you're like, what? He did what? Click. Download malware.
Exactly. Yep. So
that's on Threat Post. I thought that was pretty interesting, and it was a pretty good write-up of what they were seeing. Another article from FRSecurityMagazine.com was the Trident Crypto Fund data breach, the 266,000 passwords stolen, resulted in the publication of the usernames and passwords online. That just came out March 5th, so that's pretty recent. So you've got a crypto investment index fund that is now compromised, and what did they get? That's not good, because there's not any sort of assurances. You're not FDIC insured for your crypto fund.
Yeah, well, it's I'm just looking through this here. It's 90 says that 90% of the login and password pairs were unique and had not been found in leaks before. And I'm actually not surprised by that statistic, given that on average, those that are consumers of cryptocurrencies generally tend to be a little bit more tech savvy. And so, but I would also venture to guess that a fair amount of those are also valid for their bank account.
Yeah. Yeah. And, what's interesting again, and this goes back to kind of that lack of regulation. So this is operating out of Malta. There's no regulatory requirements. They're not reporting anything. So what exactly happened? Nobody knows. How much money was impacted? Nobody really knows yet, and I'm guessing there's going to be a lot of really unhappy people out of this.
Yeah, this will be an interesting one, to watch how it kind of unfolds, especially given the nature of cryptocurrency, right? Just to your point, there's no insurance behind this, no FDIC. Most governments refuse to even acknowledge it as a legitimate form of currency at this point. Yeah, I don't know. What I can tell you is that I see this as the beginning of a trend that I think you're going to see more attacks against. So as they try to legitimize, if you will, or commercialize, maybe is the better word, the cryptocurrency, you're gonna see more attacks against those index funds. You're going to see, I think, more attacks against the miners themselves.
Yeah,
an attempt to try to get into some of the ledgers.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, the whole purpose of that cybercrime is to make money. Where is the money? Well, let's attack that. They can get in and drain everyone's Bitcoin and be gone. That's a lot easier way to make money than ransomwaring and hoping someone pays.
For sure. And we know, thankfully, and one day I think we'll get ahead of it, but thankfully, as a rule of thumb, criminals generally take the path of least resistance, right? They're not going to work hard if they don't have to.
Yeah, I agreed. All right. So last article, this was just a interesting one. I kind of like facepalm or whatever reading it, but off of Naked Security from Sophos, Cathay Pacific Airlines was fined over crooks slurping its database for over 4 years. So the UK's ICO and Information Commissioner's Office fined Cathay Pacific around £500,000, so about $650,000, for failing to secure the information. Apparently, it was not the one-time security fail. It was at risk for over 4 years. They identified in March of 2018 that its database had been hit by a brute force attack. And then they found out as a result of that the attackers had access from October of 2014 through May of 2018, which is crazy. I don't know. Yeah, I mean,
that's just negligence. I mean, if you knew you had a brute force attack and didn't take the necessary mitigation measures to investigate, to remediate that. I mean, I don't know about you, but when I'm looking for indicators of compromise.
Well, I guess that's the bigger thing is how did they not identify the brute force attack? I mean, that's a basic logging and alerting thing that you would look for into a database is, a certain number of fails.
It is. And I think that the quote here in the article, when they were talking to the ICO, they called it a catalog of errors, right? That it wasn't just one, it was 1 + 2 + 3 + 4 and so on and so forth. And that stuff, unfortunately, is happening a lot of places. If we really start to look deep into the true root cause of any of these breaches, generally we're going to find that it wasn't a singular thing. It was a technical flaw combined with a process flaw combined with a human flaw.
Yeah.
Right. And that it took the multiple flaws to exist in order for it to be successful. Well, and I think that's what we're seeing here. And so, I'm actually glad to a certain degree that there was some type of penalty involved because, 4 years is an extensive amount of time, especially for an organization that knew that it had highly sought after information. It's not like these are, this is not recipes, right? Granted, you really do want my wife's chicken soup recipe, but it's not, this is, people's travel itineraries. This is, credit card information, numbers and personal, and driver's license numbers. And, all the things you hand over when you register for a flight. So.
Yeah, it'll be interesting, to see they're claiming only 403 expired credit card numbers and 27 credit card numbers that didn't have a CVV attached. I'd be interested to see what the PCI Council ends up doing to them because they don't like that.
Well, and I think this might end up being like some of the other breaches where the initial number was reported significantly lower, and then as the excitement around that breach kind of died out in the news cycle. Then it was like, oh, actually, it was way more than we said the first time around.
Yeah.
And part of that could be because they're continuing their investigation. But, I think there's a little bit of we don't want to say how bad it is until we have to say how bad it is. So if we have to do a disclosure, let's go with the conservative number.
Yeah, only the confirmed. Yeah.
Right. And then we'll do a quiet press release 6 months later that's like, actually, it was a couple 100,000.
Well, and if you look, I mean, in the article, it says it was 9.4 million people worldwide, 111,000 from the UK. So that £500,000 fine was based on 111,000 people, but that's a lot. And some of the basics that they identified, they weren't backups that weren't password protected, unpatched internet facing servers, OSs that were out of support, and then inadequate antivirus protection, which to me, not without knowing exactly what it is, means they probably just didn't have it.
Right. And I think in 2020, it's safe to say that is negligent.
Mm.
I think, if you are responsible for a computing system in 2020, your systems administrator, your security professional, you're, truly responsible for the healthcare and feeding of said system. You can't tell me you don't know you need anti-malware, antivirus. You can't tell me that you don't know that you need to restrict network traffic.
Right.
For internet exposed devices. It just, I struggle to, right.
Well,
I mean,
when did that become
well, there was this little operating system called Windows XP.
Right. Well, apparently they probably had some of that or some 2003s or something.
But, I think the old days of, well, we couldn't do it. We couldn't get to it. It wasn't, all the old excuses we used to hear about why the legacy gear hadn't been properly protected. Mm-hmm. I really believe that we're entering a time when the average consumer knows better and is saying, no, that's completely unacceptable.
Yeah.
So maybe some more, things like this where there's, actual consequence. Although I will say $500,000 to an airline probably is not actual consequence. I mean,
Yeah, I know. I'm with you. It's tough. Yeah. At some point, there's going to have to be something more. But baby steps, I guess. We'll get going.
Well, something's better than nothing.
Yep. Hey, at least they were found to have these issues, and the actual report, which there is a link to, is pretty well written. So it's clear that they were not doing what needed to be done. So we'll see what happens with that moving forward. All right. Well, that is it. Episode 70 is a wrap. Thank you to our listeners. Keep the questions and feedback coming. Send them to us by email at unsecurity@protonmail.com. If you're the social type, socialize with us on Twitter. I'm at Brad Nye. Evan is at Evan Francine. And Ryan, you are?
At Cloutier Sec.
There you go. CLOUTIERSEC. See, I know how to spell it.
Correct. Just call me Cola. That's what Evan does.
I know. I'm going to start. Yeah. That's what we'll have to do. Lastly, be sure to follow Security Studio at Studio Security and FRSecure at FRSecure for more goodies. That is it. Talk to you again next week, and with Evan nicely refreshed.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the UNSECURITY podcast. We value our listeners and would love to hear from you. Give us your feedback by emailing us at unsecurity@protonmail.com. That's UNSECURITY@PROTONMAIL.com. Be sure to tune in next week to hear the latest insights from Brad and Evan.